Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the member for Canning moving the following motion: that this House, 1, condemns defacing any war memorial monument in Australia for any reason at any time, and 2, further condemns the defacing of the Australian War Memorial on June 14 and the Korean War, Vietnam War and Army memorials on ANZAC Parade in Canberra on Saturday, with language including the violent from the river to the sea slogan. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. There are around 4,000 to 5,000 war memorials across Australia that have been erected to honour and commemorate Australia's war dead over the last century. Small, grieving towns and large cities alike erected these memorials in the wake of the calamity of the First World War. 60,000 Australians perished in the First World War, a huge number of men killed for such a young and relatively small nation. Australian historian Geoffrey Blaney, in his shorter history of Australia, put it like this: perhaps the most drastic effect of the war would never be enumerated. It was the loss of all those talented Australians who would have become prime ministers and premiers, judges, divines, engineers, teachers, doctors, poets, inventors and farmers, the mayors of towns and leaders of trade unions, and the fathers of another generation of Australians. It was a war in which those with the gift of leadership, the spark of courage and the willingness to make sacrifices often took the highest risks. A young nation could not afford to lose such men. Geoffrey Blaney goes on to say that that's why we responded in the way we did, with so many memorials across our great country. He goes on to say, no nation in Europe showed such a visible desire to remember and to honour. And we've added to those memorials with subsequent wars. We fought in the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War and, more recently, the Afghan War. And all those wars, sadly, have led to the loss of more Australian men and women in service. We have 103,000 war dead remembered on those memorials across this nation. It's a reminder that this nation has sacrificed greatly and has borne the cost of war. That's why the Australian War Memorial was built and opened on Remembrance Day in 1941, and why ANZAC Parade was opened on ANZAC Day in 1965 by Sir Robert Menzies. ANZAC Parade is lined with memorials on both sides: the Hellenic Memorial, the Kemal Ataturk Memorial, the Army, Navy and Air Force Memorials, the Service Nurses Memorial, the Rats of Tobruk Memorial, the Boer War, Vietnam War, Korean War Memorials and the Desert Mounted Corps Memorial. And the architecture and design of all those memorials remind us of sacrifice. They remind us of sacrifice and the values of our fighting men and women, the values of service, of courage, of respect, of integrity and excellence. And these are Australian values, and our ADF are their custodians. If you go to the website, to the ADF, you'll see those values listed out: service, courage, respect, integrity and excellence. Australians have fought for these values, Australians have died for these values, and our memorials reflect these values, and that's why the ugly defacement and desecration of our war memorials are so disgraceful. It dishonours our war dead, and this, sadly, is a pattern that has emerged over the last 6 months. We have seen on the 11th of November of last year the Melbourne War Memorial vandalised on Remembrance Day. On the 12th of January 2024, we saw the Tasmanian War Memorial vandalised. On the 11th of March, we saw the Vietnam War Memorial vandalised. In May of this year, we saw the Hyde Park ANZAC Memorial vandalised after protests. Red dye was poured into the pool of reflection. On the 14th of June 2024, the Australian War Memorial was vandalised with pro-Palestinian slogans. And just on the weekend, the Korean War Memorial, the Vietnam War Memorial and the Army War Memorial on ANZAC Parade were vandalised. But this vandalism represents something far deeper and grotesque. This vandalism is an attack on our Australian values, but it's also an attack on our way of life. It's an attack on the thing that binds us together, a shared heritage of service and sacrifice, something that all Australians on April 25th every year, ANZAC Day, come together and focus on as a nation. But sadly, Deputy Speaker, it goes even deeper than that. On the Vietnam and Korean war memorials were written phrases like this, and I quote, "They didn't die so we could fund genocide. side. Free Gaza, blood on your hands, free Palestine, and the most disgraceful, from the river to the sea. A deeply anti-Semitic slogan with origins in violent terrorism. Indeed, From the River to the Sea has its origins in the Hamas Charter of 2017. Hamas is a terrorist organisation listed by the Australian Commonwealth. It is committed to the destruction of the Jewish people and the State of Israel. It is an organisation driven by extreme religious ideology that celebrates death and violence and hatred. They are people who will not compromise. And just in case people don't believe this, I'll make it very clear. I'm going to read now from the 2017 Hamas Charter, the document of general principles and policies, paragraph 20, and it says this: Hamas believes that no part of the land of Palestine shall be compromised or conceded, irrespective of the causes, the circumstances and the pressures, and no matter how long the occupation lasts. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine, and here are the words: from the river to the sea. Hamas represents the worst of humanity, and we've all heard it said, by a fruit its tree shall be known. On October 7th, we saw the poisonous and evil fruit of Hamas's ideology on full display when they attacked and murdered and raped more than 1,000 Israelis, innocent Israelis, on that terrible day. And now we have Australians defacing our war memorials with phrases straight out of the Hamas Charter. In this country now, we are seeing mob rule challenge the rule of law. We are seeing the mob tear apart our social cohesion. We are seeing the mob challenge the values that define our nation. And we are seeing the mob trample on our war dead and the values they died for. And everyone here on this side of the House condemns in the strongest possible terms this vile, disgraceful, destructive and divisive un-Australian behaviour. Deputy Speaker, we've all been touched in some way or other by October 7th. And I think of some Jewish friends in Melbourne who I came to know through this tragedy. A couple who were living in my electorate of Canning who contacted me soon after October 7th. I'll leave their names off Hansard in order to protect them because they feel unsafe. They are Jewish Australians, and the female, her mother was killed by Hamas on October 7th. She just rang her up to let her know she was pregnant. Her brother was killed, protecting his family, and her 10-month-old niece was brutally murdered. And I think of her when I read From the River to the Sea, as an Australian. How must she feel having suffered so badly at the hands of evil terrorism? It fills me with shame. It fills all of us with shame. And that's why we raise this today in the House. And I say it again, we condemn this in the strongest possible terms. But, Deputy Speaker, this is not an isolated pattern of behaviour. We're seeing electoral offices across the country also targeted. We've seen the Prime Minister's office besieged by protesters chanting the same sorts of things. We've seen the Deputy Prime Ministers. We've seen the Attorney Generals. We've seen the Minister for Immigration. We've seen the Minister for NDIS. We've seen the Member for Franklin, the Member for Wills, the Member for Cooper, the Member for Jagga Jagga, the Member for McNamara, the Member for Riverina. I could go on. This is a pattern of behaviour which is tearing at the cohesion of this country. We're seeing our universities encamped by protesters who are willing to chant the same slogans that we find in the Hamas Charter. We're seeing this at the University of Sydney, the University of Melbourne, Monash University, University of Adelaide, University of Queensland, the Australian National University, Deakin University, Curtin University, RMIT University, La Trobe University, the University of Wollongong and the University of Tasmania. We have a rot at the heart of Australian society right now, and we have young Australians who are chanting terrorist slogans and defacing our war memorials. And it's got to stop. It requires political leadership, and that's why we're raising this issue right now. We believe this issue demands political leadership, and we want to ensure that our law enforcement agencies across the states feel that they have our backing to enforce the law, enforce the rule of law, to arrest these people, to prosecute these people, and send a message that in Australia, in modern Australia, with all its diversity, it will only cohere if people respect each other, respect the rule of law, and uphold Australian values that I've outlined today. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.